Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, amma ba'd. So, the purpose of this presentation is that there's a huge disconnect between the Christian laity and their academic scholarship, right? And I'll provide an account of this, right? So if you speak to Christians normally on the scene, they're very ignorant of the state of scholarship regarding the textual criticism of the Bible and its history, its transmission process, etc. Often what you'll hear them say is that the Bible represents the eyewitness accounts of the disciples of Jesus, and as such, we have every reason to believe it. And why would we believe the Quran, which came 600 years after? Why would we not believe the disciples who died for their beliefs, etc., etc.? This is the common Christian apologetic that you'll hear often. The reality is, however, that the basic consensus of all scholars is that this is not true. The Bible does not represent the eyewitness accounts of the early Christians. It represents later doctrinally developed stages of textual transmission that represent polemical engagement from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. Right. So to give you a basic starting point to begin to the preface of the revised standard version, right? So as many of you guys know, there's many different versions of Bibles. There's no one Bible. There's many different Bibles, and in fact, they constantly get updated, right? There's a whole long textual history of the Bible. So we read in the Revised Standard Version that it says that, this is at the preface, right? It says, the King James Version, which was published in 1611 under the authority of King James, what they say is this, right? Yet the King James Version has grave defects, right? So these are a group of scholars who are writing the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, and they're commenting on the King James Bible, which up until that point is the most popular version and most widespread version of the Bible, right? It has the most widespread acceptancy. And they're saying that the King James Version has grave defects, so much so that by the middle of the 19th century, the development of biblical studies and the discovery of many manuscripts more ancient than those upon which the King James Version was based made it were so many and so serious as to call for revision of the English translation. So what they're saying is that biblical development, or in particular German scholarship, was advanced to such a stage that they found new manuscripts that made the old manuscripts that they were relying on very clearly defective. Right, because the earlier the manuscript, the earlier the tradition, commonly, right? Therefore, they chose to revise the King James Version, and they made the Revised Standard Version in 1971, and this is the 2nd edition. They say this task was undertaken under the authority of the Church of England in 1870, right? And it was published in 1881 to 1885. Then you had the American Standardized Version and its variants embodying basically the American scholarly consensus of what they considered to be variants or not, right? So this is basically the reason why I'm putting this here is so that you guys are aware. Now, this is not like some Muslim attack of Christianity. This is something that's found within their own scholars, their own leaders of their own traditions, their own scholarly class agrees and acknowledges that the textual criticism of the Bible is weak and it has many defects. Even today, if you go out and you speak to Christians, majority of them, they'll rely on the King James Version, right? If you ask them, what Bible do you read? Most of them say King James, right? Even though the majority of critical scholars will tell you that the King James, by all scholarly consensus, has the most defects, or has great defects that are very well documented. So whenever you engage with a Christian, make sure to point out to them that this is not something that, no one is aware of or whatever. This is something within their own scholarly class. And that's why I say there's a big disconnect between the Christian scholarship and the Christian laity. And we have to be the ones bridging that gap and educating them on these issues, right? All right, so now we need to just define a few key terms, right? So what is corruption? So we're talking about textual corruption, but what does that actually mean, right? What does it mean for something to be corrupt? And textual corruption refers to any alteration of the biblical text, whether that's intentional or accidental, right? That diverges from the original word or meaning, right? So even changes in phraseology. So, for example, if a scribe adds a commentary of a text, like there's a text and he adds a tafsir to it, or if he straight out omits something, or adds something, or interpolates something, this is all classed as corruption, whether he did it intentionally or unintentionally. As long as it changes the meaning of the verse, as long as it can change the meaning of the verse, right, or gives an alternate meaning to the verse, then it's counted as a corruption of the text, right? So I hope that's pretty clear, right? So Bruce Metzger, who's pretty much the most renowned textual critic of the New Testament, he says that any deviation from the original text, whether by accident or design, constitutes a corruption of the text. This is the definition of corruption that you guys should all be familiar with, and you should have this reference on hand, right? So I'll repeat it again. Any deviation from the original text, whether by accident or design, constitutes a corruption of the text, right? And this is also confirmed by other scholars like Wallace, Metzger, F.F. Bruce, and so on. It's also worth noting that even figures who are revered within the tradition, so Origen of Alexandria was a church father, or he's a heretic now because he believed in universalism and pre-existence of the souls and whatever. But at the time he existed, he was seen as a church father, or at the very least, if they want to dispute that, he's a respected ecclesiastical writer, right? And he notes himself, so he's a witness to what's going on, and he's living in the 3rd century. He says that the differences among the manuscripts have become great, either through the negligence of some copyists or through the perverse audacity of others. They add or remove what they please. This is on his commentary of Matthew 15:14. So we have independent traditions. Imagine, basically, like, to put it in context, imagine Imam Ahmad, right, rahimahullah, he says the Quranic manuscripts have so many differences because I see people next to me, they're perverting the Quranic manuscripts. They're adding whatever they want, they remove whatever they want, they take out whatever they want. And this is like an analogy. One of the people of your sunnah, right, the people who you considered orthodox, or who was considered orthodox during his day, right, one of those people is basically testifying to the corruption that's taking place during his time, right? And he's not the only ecclesiastical writer to do this. Justin Martyr also acknowledges the same thing, for example, in Dialogue with Trypho with the Old Testament, and Jerome acknowledges the same thing. This is something that's ongoing, right? Because each sect, or each different part of Christianity is constantly fighting with each other. There are these intersectarian Christological disputes that are going on, and as such, they have incentive to corrupt the scripture, to basically try and validate their interpretation or understanding of Christianity. Philip Comfort, he says, in some cases, scribes did not merely copy the text but interpreted it, often smoothing or altering readings for doctrinal purposes. So what does this mean? It means that scribes didn't just copy the text. What they did is add their commentary. It's natural. Sometimes you read a verse and you want to add your tafsir, right? So famous example of this is 1 John chapter 5 verse 7, right? For there are 3 that bear record in heaven, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and these 3 are one, right? This was initially a tafsir. It's a marginal note, like a scribe added this in as a marginal note, as a tafsir, but it became part of the text. How does that happen? Well, because scribes weren't just copying things verbatim, they were also writing their notes. They're writing their notes on the side. And not only were they doing that, sometimes they would harmonize readings. So, for example, if there was something that looked weird to us, something that seemed off, something that didn't align with what they believed, they would have the liberty to change that or to harmonize the text. That's what scholars call it. They call it harmonization, right? So this idea of a fixed New Testament corpus didn't really emerge till the 4th century. It's not until the 4th century that these Christological and theological disputes are kind of set in stone. Like there kind of becomes like a uniformity to it. Why? Well, because in the 4th century, you get the Nicene Creed, you get the Constantinopolitan Creed, you get a sense of orthodoxy. And if you're not following this, then you're going against outside the orthodoxy. So an orthodoxy becomes like fixed and established. And as such, the text also becomes more fixed than it was before. Before it was regional. So what I want you guys to understand is you have these different regions. You have Antioch, you have people in Jerusalem, Galilee, you have people up north, people down south. You have all these different regions, and each of them has their own textual tradition. And there's no guarantee. And in fact, we know for a fact that their textual traditions were different, and that these textual traditions would be harmonized in line with the theological ideas of each particular region, right? Like Kurt and Barbara, they say, not until the 4th century did we have manuscripts in which the text is written with some degree of uniformity. So it's not until the 4th century. And why is this the case? Well, that's because that's when Christianity becomes a state. That's when we have imperialist Christianity, particularly under Constantine, right? And this is according to Eusebius. So we read here, prior to the time of Constantine, the New Testament text was in a state of flux, characterized by local text rather than a uniform canon. Okay, this is very, very important. But essentially, at the beginning, the New Testament corpus is not a fixed text. For us, as Muslims, the Quran was a fixed text. It was fixed by the Sahaba, by Uthman, by Abu Bakr, by the Prophet himself, right? For them, that's not the case till the 4th century. So almost 400 years have passed by until they have a fixed text, right? So what does this look like? This is essentially a little snapshot of what we have, or what the manuscript tradition says. So in the first 100 years, we have literally nothing. We have nothing. So 0, no parchment, no papyrus, nothing. In the 2nd century, we start getting scraps. We get P52, which is like the first bit of the Gospel of John, nice little scrap, right? Then in the 200s, we start getting slightly bigger chunks, more chunks and chunks and chunks. So now it's slightly bigger. Then in the 300s, that's when we get our first complete Bibles, right? Our first complete Bible is in the 300s, 400s, right? So like Codex Sinaiticus is like late 4th century, right? Mid to late 4th century, okay? So what does this mean? So for the first 200 years, we only have 24 scattered verses plus the first chapter of Revelation. And this is when the majority of error is likely to have happened. How do we know this? After the 400s-500s, in the 9th century, then we start getting a bunch of medieval scribes. These medieval scribes are really, really good at copying. The mistakes that scribes make from the medieval period onwards, because they're literally trained scribes, is far less. The degree of variation is way less. So, but if you go backwards in time, you see that century by century, the variation increases. So if you go 9th century, 8th century, 7th century, and you build a diagram like this, essentially, if you build a diagram, you'll see that the variation rates increase. And if you just track that variation, and you say, okay, what would if the trend continues, what would the variation look like in the earliest centuries when Christianity was the most volatile, when it was not fixed, when it was not uniform, when there were these doctrinal disputes going on, right? And when people had the motivation to change and harmonize and alter and add to the text, what would we expect the rate of change to be in the earlier centuries, in the 1st and 2nd centuries? We would expect it to be even greater. And this is pretty much by consensus. No one disputes this fact, that the early scribes would be far more prone to error, to harmonization, to alteration than later scribes. And that is where the majority of these changes would have been happening. Right? There are changes that come after. There are still variations and corruptions that happen after, right? Like, for example, 1 John chapter 5 verse 7 that I just mentioned, it happened in the 14th century, right? But that's really the exception. The rule is most of these changes and variations would be happening in the first 3 centuries of Christianity, when Christianity was the most volatile, when the text was not fixed, when there was no one to check over anything, when there was no right or wrong version of the text. Everyone just had their own codicy. So now let's talk about the codices, right? So we need to introduce our manuscripts, right? So the ones that you guys should be mainly familiar with are the ones that I have up on screen right now. So the first two are Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. I mentioned them briefly. These are our first complete New Testament manuscripts, right? And in fact, they have a little bit extra. So some of them have, for example, like the Shepherd of Hermas and the Assumption of Moses and things like that, like these apocryphal texts, I should say. But the point is that they have all of the New Testament as you have it now, right? So they have, you know, the 27 books of the New Testament, the letters of Paul, and even parts of the Old Testament, right? So these texts are the first complete manuscripts, right? As Ehrman and Metzger say, the chief sources for reconstructing the New Testament are great unical codices, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus above all. And these provide the base text for nearly all modern editions. So all modern editions, the ones that we see now, they go back to Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. Why? Because these are the first two earliest complete manuscripts, right? The rest of these are slightly later. So these are 3rd, 4th century. The rest of these are 5th, 6th century, right? And then they have their own particular tradition. So you have like an Alexandrian tradition, a Byzantine tradition, etc., right? You have different forms of the text, right, that stabilize. It's also key to realize that the primary critical text above that comprise the modern biblical text is based in diverse traditions prior to the period of uniformity, which we said was the 4th century. And a full exact retrieval of the canonical 27 books at the Council of Hippo and the Council of Carthage, and later in 419, is an impossibility, right? The broad consensus among textual critics and textual scholars is as follows. The original autographs are lost. While existing manuscripts contain textual variants, none of them preserves the original words. What does this mean? So what is an autographal text? The autographal text is the one that was originally written, right? The first text, the original, right? It's basically a consensus that we don't have the originals and we can't even get close to what the originals were. They're lost to history. So, for example, these scholars say, we must frankly admit that we simply do not have access to the autographs, and the surviving manuscripts present a flawed tradition, not a fixed, stable text. Meaning, basically, as we said, the text was initially fluid, and because of this initial fluidity for the first 3 centuries, we can't reconstruct what the original was, because there's been so many changes, we have no idea what that would even look like, right? Similarly, Metzger and Ehrman, they say the same thing. They say the original text is not preserved in any single manuscript, and no manuscript preserves the New Testament as it was exactly written, right? As it was originally written. So this is common knowledge, consensus. No one really disputes this. It's not really under any kind of contest, right? So then, okay, well then someone can ask a question. Well, you know, if we don't have the originals, what's the point of doing textual criticism? What's the point of doing textual criticism if we can't get to what Matthew and Luke and Mark actually wrote? Like, what's the point? Well, the point is that we get to basically what I call just the common links. So we get to the earliest possible reconstruction that we can do. And that earliest possible reconstruction that we can do will probably be somewhere in the 3rd century, somewhere in the 2nd century max. You can't get any further than that. Like, you can just say, oh, this one looks more likely to be original. This one looks less likely to be original. That's it. You can't say for certain, right? So that's the purpose of textual criticism, essentially to see which ones are later additions, interpolations, which ones are likely earlier. But even the ones that we say are likely earlier doesn't mean it's original. There's a big gap between likely earlier and originally what Mark wrote. we have no way of knowing if that's actually the case or not. Right? This is very, very important. We briefly spoke about corruption. So corruption, like we said, was an addition or omission that materially affects the sense of the text, right? So that's what we said. But there are different types of corruption. Corruption is not all the same, right? So prior to the uniformity, which was we said was in the 4th century, there had not been yet a biblical canonization of the universal church, and hundreds of gospels were in circulation, with various churches corresponding traditions considered to be divine revelation. Irregardless of tradition, whether it's Roman Catholic or Proto-Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox, corruptors soak these early traditions with anonymity and skills lacking in accurate transmissions. So both the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches have inherited texts which, though vulnerable, are based upon a tradition which has experienced centuries of textual corruption, both accidental and intentional, prior to the fixing of the canon. Right, and I'm going to go through some examples of this, but it's important to note that the vast majority of Christians who are following either like Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy have inherited a corrupt textual tradition. And the types of corruption are two types, right? Either primary or secondary. So primary corruptors are those who directly altered the text. So like the scribes, the editors, the redactors, these are people who are the ones doing the actual corruption. Secondary corruptors are individuals who indirectly cause corruption. So this can be via theology or doctrine or any kind of theological decision, right? These types of corruptors stem from the period of antiquity, even after the 5th century, right? So as Ummah notes, he says, the process of transmission was deeply theological. There were not only accidental mistakes, but deliberate changes meant to shape the emerging orthodoxy, right? So again, like I was saying, you have to keep different sects. You have the Docetists, you have the Adoptionists, you have the Proto-Orthodox, you have the two-stage logos theorists, you have all these different sects and groups. You have the Gnostics, and they're all fighting with each other over the text to try and make it say what they want it to say. Or if there's some part that rid of it, they want to smooth it over to make it more in line with their theology. And all of these people have these conflicting motives. First, it's basically a battleground between these different sects and political parties. So what are some examples of primary corruption, right? So primary corruption is, like we said, a direct interpolation into the text. For example, we have 1 Timothy 3:16. The original text reads, "He who was manifest in the flesh." This is the earlier, more well-attested version. He who was manifested in the flesh. Later scribes change this to God manifest in the flesh. So they changed it to Theos, who was manifest in the flesh. Obviously, why do you think someone did that? Well, because they wanted to make they wanted to make it more clearly divine. They wanted it to be as clear as possible that Jesus who were disputing Jesus' divinity and or who disputed the degree of divinity. How exactly is Jesus, right? Like Arius, for example. He's divine, but in what sense is he divine? Right? So because of that, they want to make it as clear as possible. No, he's like divine. He's very divine. So that's why they changed it. Okay, this is an example of a primary corruption. Or for example, John 1:18. This is another one. One reading, most likely, this one is like 50-50 scholars are on. Some scholars say begotten son, and others say begotten God, right? So you have one tradition which says the begotten son, the other one says the begotten God. Okay, now why would you change begotten son to begotten God? Obviously, again, for the same reason. You want to emphasize the divinity of Christ. Why? Because there are people who are disputing it. So it's the same kind of thing. You want to emphasize the divinity of Christ. Okay. An example of a secondary corruption, John chapter 5, verse 3. Right? John chapter 5, verse 3. So what is this secondary corruption in John chapter 5, verse 3? Well, in this case, someone is adding their tafsir into the verse. Okay, so like we said, for example, 1 John chapter 5, verse 7, there are scribes who would add in their explanation or exegesis of a particular verse, right? So if you read the shorter version, or the more likely the original, right, it says, sick people lie near the pool, and it mentions that the water is being stirred. But it doesn't mention who's stirring the water. So it kind of leaves an open-ended question. Who's the one stirring the water? So what did scribes do? They had the same question. Well, who's the one stirring the water? The water. So what they did was they added that an angel came down and the angel stirred the water, right? And then the person was healed. So what's he doing? He's exegeting the text. But in doing so, he's corrupting the text because he's changing the meaning. What if the original person didn't mean that an angel was stirring it? What if he didn't mean it? What if he meant something else was stirring it? It's possible, right? It's possible. So this is very clearly scholars call this an explanatory gloss. A scribe added a legend or like an explanation to clarify why the sick man wanted to enter the water when it moved, right? And pretty much some scholars like Wallace, they argue that John did not put the angel explanation there and pretty much say that it started off as a marginal note, similar to 1 John chapter 5 verse 7, right? So Parker, he says here, what we have is the result of a process of copying and recopying in which countless changes have been introduced, some accidentally and some deliberately. The text has been shaped by theological concerns, by liturgical practice, and by the desire to harmonize divergent passages. So scribes are noticing contradictions, noticing places where things are unclear or things could be problematic from a theological perspective, and they're trying to harmonize it. And they're trying to smooth things over, right? It's important to note that this tradition is inherited by like pretty much every sect. So Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Protestant, doesn't matter. Your text is corrupted. It's not like one sect is free from this corruption. They're not. Another example that of primary corruption is Luke 22:43 to 44, right? This is the agony in the garden, right? Or the blood sweating passage, right? This passage here is a very important passage because this passage is a corruption, and it tells us like what kind of motivations there were for corruptions happening early on. Let's read the passage, right? So the passage is, and there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down upon the ground. Okay, so if you notice, this is the only place in Luke where Jesus feels pain and agony. It's the only place. Every other place in Luke, Jesus is not portrayed as feeling agony, right? He's not portrayed as hurt. This is the only place in Luke, right? Now, so why was this verse put in? Or why was this interpolated, right? Well, Thomas Hardwell-Thorne tells us. He tells us, look, the reason for the omission of these verses in some manner, for their being marked as suspected in others, is by some supposed to have been that they were rejected by some of the more timid, lest they should favor the Arians. Why would this verse favor the Arians? Because the Arians believed in the more human part of Jesus. They believed in the more human part of Jesus. So later Christians, there was a people of Christians, they're called Docetists. This is an early sect of Christianity. And there were a group of Christians called Docetists, and dose means to seem, like in the Greek, it means to seem. That's where it comes from, the etymology of the word. So these groups of Christians believed that Jesus only seemed to suffer. He didn't actually suffer. And some Arians adopted these Docetic beliefs, right? So these Docetists believed that Jesus only seemed to suffer. And they wanted precedent for their view that Jesus only seemed to suffer. The proto-Orthodox, so the people like Irenaeus, Justin, these guys, these proto-Orthodox fathers and writers, they want to argue against the Docetists. And they want to say, no, it's not just Jesus seemed to suffer, he actually did suffer. So they added this verse in. They added this verse in where Jesus is explicitly, the only place in Luke where Jesus explicitly suffers. And you can't argue that, oh, he just seemed to suffer. No, he literally suffers. The text is very clear. So Bruce Metzger says, these verses are absent from some of the earliest and best witnesses, including the majority of Alexandrian scripts, right? It is striking to note that the earliest witnesses attesting to these verses are the three church fathers, Irenaeus, Justin, and Hippolytus, each of whom uses the verses in order to counter Christological views that maintain that Jesus was not a full human who experienced the full range of human sufferings. It may well be that the verses were added to the text for just this reason, in opposition to those who held a Docetic Christology. So this is what we call an anti-Docetic interpolation. It's an interpolation to the text, a corruption, right, an assertion into the text that was put in specifically to counter another doctrinal view. Now, as historians, we don't get to judge which view is more authentic or not. Like as a secular historian, it's not their place to say this view is more correct than the other view, right? You're supposed to be theologically neutral. But what we're seeing here is that the proto-Orthodox are corrupting the text in order to refute heretics. Essentially, from their perspective, they're trying to refute heretics, right? Similarly, Ehrman notes the same thing. And he also adds that another reason why we know this verse is an interpolation is because it disrupts the literary structure of the scene. I'll get this out of the way now. One of the reason or criteria, how do we know if a verse is interpolated? It comes down to a multiplicity of factors. First of all, it comes to manuscript attestation. If it's absent from the earliest and best manuscripts, that's a good reason for thinking someone added it in later. Two, the criteria of dissimilarity, right? So if something is dissimilar or embarrassing, or like basically, if there's a long version of a text and a short version of a text, it's more likely that someone would add to the short version and explain it than someone would take a long text and shorten it, right? It's just, that's like the criteria of dissimilarity, right? Then you have things like doctrinal questions. So basically, like, if a text is theologically useful, that's also another reason or a motivation for why it could have been changed. So, for example, if the change itself seems to favor one theology over another, that's a plausible reason for why someone could have messed with the text. Someone could have changed the text, right? So, and then another reason is stylometry. We look at the style of the author and see whether it fits with his already established style. So we can do stylometric analysis and see that, for example, this kind of language is never used in Luke. So it's weird that just here he just uses it. Do you get me? So taking into combination all of these factors, and then also we look at church father attestation and things like that. So taking into consideration all of these factors, then we make a judgment of, okay, is this text likely interpolated, or what exactly is the case here? And we can see how that's being applied to this text. So in this case, we have it's absent from the earliest manuscripts. It's not the same style as Luke that we already know. It clearly favors one theology over another, right? And everyone who uses it from the church fathers uses it specifically for this purpose of refuting the Docetists. So it seems very, very likely, like pretty much, we can't say certainty, but very, very likely that this is an anti-docetic interpolation in Luke. All right. Canonical uniformity and the later Textus Receptus, right? So canonical uniformity, particularly by later Christian centuries, to establish a single authoritative text of the New Testament, right? So like we said before, like before the 4th century, in the 3rd century, 2nd century, 1st century, the text was regional and it was very fluid. And it's not until the 4th century that we get some sense of fixation, right? It is the drive for orthodoxy and stability that led to textual modifications, not some accidental, intentional, like basically what we're saying is it's basically extremely clear if you study the text that the reason why these changes were happening is for theological purposes, for doctrinal purposes, for liturgical purposes. People were smoothing over the text for these reasons, right? So to combat this, and the church is aware of this, like we said, we cited Origen and Justin and Hippolytus and Eusebius. These fathers, they're all aware of the corruption that's happening because they're comparing traditions. They're reading different versions of the same text. So they see these contradictions, they see these variant readings, they see these interpolations happening right in front of them. But they don't know where it's coming from. They just receive a text. They don't know why is one different from the other, right? And yet, this problem was recognized by the church. So what they did was they tried to make a single canon, like uniform version of the text, which they called the Textus Receptus, or the received text, which became popular and served as the foundation for the King James Version in 1611, right? The guy who compiled it, his name was Erasmus, and the revisions made were later filled and translated into the Latin Vulgate, right, which was translated later into Greek, right? The Textus Receptus is a legitimate witness to a particular stage in the New Testament's reception history. We cannot understand the full story of the textual development without it, right? It is the very critical text that these scholars say, and many other critics have used to uncover many primary, secondary corruptions that occurred throughout the biblical evolutionary process. So we can compare the textual receptus with what came before it and what came after it and see that even in this later stage, there's still corruption and interpolation happening. So that's the degree of corruption that we're talking about, right? So it's important to note that to understand that this kind of process is a very human process. I mean, just think about it. You don't have anyone, and this is one of the reasons I think he struggled, or he left fundamentalism, which is basically he's trying to say that, look, if this is the word of God, the Bible's the word of God, right? The Christians say the Bible's the word of God. If this is the word of God, why is it there are places where we're not sure what God actually wants us to say? There are some places where we're not sure what the original reading is. If God really sent us his word, wouldn't he try and preserve it? True or false? This is a logical thought, okay? You can ask a Christian this. If you truly believe that this is the word of God, why wouldn't God, if he went to all the trouble of sending it down to you, why wouldn't he take the trouble of preserving it? This is a valid question, and it's a valid shubha that led one of the leading Christian New Testament scholars to become agnostic. This is one of the reasons he left fundamentalism and ultimately became agnostic, right? Okay. So now let's go through some examples of fabrications and interpolations. So I've gone through one or two already, but it's worth going through a few more just so you guys get a sense of what's going on. So I've gone through the criteria of how we know some texts are interpolated, how we know some texts aren't, right? But let's go through a few more. The first example is the story of the woman caught in adultery. Now, I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with this, right? So the passage is from John 7 to John 8, and it's pretty much regarded by the consensus of scholars as a fabrication, right? It was a oral tradition that likely existed in the 2nd and 3rd century that was so good that people had to put it into the text, even though it had no textual basis at all. So Ehrman says here in his book, Studies in the Textual Criticism of the New Testament, he says, the difficulty of the task is in part that none of our primary witnesses, the Greek manuscripts, is in complete agreement with another, right? So there's always variations between them. Sometimes the disagreements are extremely minor and of very little moment. So for example, sometimes it can just be misspelling or an error, or a scribe, he made a mistake, he fell asleep while he was copying, he copied the same thing twice, whatever. You have these kinds of scribal mistakes. These are kind of minor variations, not very important, and this is the majority of the variation. But he says sometimes the disagreements are extremely, but sometimes they are of supreme importance. Today there is widespread agreement that the story of the woman taken in adultery was not originally part of the 4th gospel, but was added by later scribes. The same can be said of the final 12 verses of the Gospel of Mark. So we have two, and these are the two pretty much, whenever someone talks about corruption, these two are the main ones that people speak about, because these ones are like verse after verse after verse. The rest of these corruptions are usually just like one verse, or like one word, or just a small addition or a small explanation, right? But these are, the Gospel of Mark is a complete ending, like the ending changed, and then for the Gospel of John, the pericope adulterae, this is a complete story inserted into the text. So this is like a whole story for both of them, just completely added in when it has no place being there in both of these cases. So let's go through each one by one, right? So the story of the woman caught in adultery, right? Here, some woman, which some people think is Mary Magdalene, but probably it was just a random woman, was caught committing adultery by the Jewish crowd, right? No mention is made of the man she was caught with. She alone is brought before Jesus as to be condemned, right? So the Jews bring her to Jesus and say, we caught this woman doing adultery. What should we do with her? And the reason why the Jews are doing this is because they want to trap Jesus. So if you read the Gospel of John, the whole point of it, or the Bible in general, the New Testament in general, the Jews are being tricky with Jesus. They're trying to corner him, right? Because deep down inside, they know he's the Messiah, but they want to find reasons to reject him. So they're constantly testing him, right? So this is one of their tests, apparently, right? So they bring the Jewish woman to Jesus who's committed adultery, and they say, look, what should we do with her? And the trick is this: if you say stone her, right, then you're going to get in trouble with the Romans, because you just killed a woman for no reason. In Roman law, you're going to get in trouble and you're going to be locked away. If you don't stone her, then you're violating the law of Moses, because the law of Moses says stone her. So heads I win, tails you lose. That's the Jews. That's what the Jews are doing, right? This is their scheme. Jesus, he responds and he says, let the one who's without sin cast the first stone. So basically he says, look, the one who's without sin, cast the first stone. And he starts writing on the sand, and they all realize they're sinful, and then they all walk away. This is how Jesus diffuses the situation, right? So Codex Bezae and the Textus Receptus contain the above story, while P66, P77, Codex Sinaiticus, Alexandrius, and Vaticanus all omit the entire passage. The story is not present in any pre-5th century manuscript. It may well have been an oral tradition which made its way into the text, but it's definitely not the words of the supposed author John. This story is definitely not the work of the author John. Now, so what do we have here? We have so the criteria we mentioned. It's not there in the earliest and best manuscripts. The style of it also doesn't match the rest of the author of John. The place it's inserted doesn't really make sense. And in fact, if you look at the manuscript tradition, some people even have the story at the end of Luke, like somewhere at the end of Luke. So it's flexible, meaning scribes, when they were putting this in, they didn't know where to put it. It's not like they all agreed, oh, hey, let's put it in John 7. Some scribes put it in other places. Some scribes put it in Luke, or some scribes put it in a different part of John. So that shows that it wasn't originally there, because they're struggling where to put it, right? Another thing is that this story is anachronistic. Right? Now, if you think about it, you might think, how's it anachronistic? What's so anachronistic about it? This is the only place in the entire New Testament where Jesus writes. There's not a single other place in the New Testament where Jesus Christ is shown writing. He writes in the sand, and the Jews look at it. So, but we know just from prior background knowledge that Jesus was illiterate. He couldn't, he couldn't read or write. He wasn't formally educated, right? So he was not trained to write. He couldn't write. The only other places, like when he's reciting the Torah or he's reciting Isaiah, right? He's reading the scrolls. But that's not the same as writing. Reading and writing is not the same thing. There's no other place in the New Testament where Jesus writes. This is the only place. And Jesus he didn't go to school for him to learn how to write. How does he know how to write? So this is another reason why we know this is clearly interpolated. The historical Jesus never did this, right? This is a fabricated story that was just added in later. Okay. So for these reasons, so look at how I broke it down for you guys. So we look at manuscript attestation, church father, and by the way, yeah, none of the church fathers talk about the story and reference it as John. So no one makes reference to this story like before the 4th century, and saying, oh, it's in John 7, whatever, right? So look, it's not attested in the earliest and best manuscripts. It's anachronistic. It doesn't pass the stylometry of the author of John. It has a fluid manuscript tradition. Scribes don't know where to put it, right? So for all these reasons, we can very clearly see it's an interpolation. These are the criteria that we use, and this is how we apply them, right? So now let's see what Emin says about this. The story is not found in our earliest and best manuscripts of John. Its writing style is very different from what we find in the rest of John, including the stories immediately before and after. It includes a large number of words and phrases that are otherwise alien to the gospel. The conclusion is unavoidable. This passage was not originally part of the gospel. Most scholars think that it was probably a well-known circulating in the oral tradition of Jesus, which at some point was added in the margin of a manuscript, and then from there it became part of the text, right? So essentially, Emin is using the same criteria that we use. He's saying, look, it's not early, people didn't know where to put it, style is different, and so on and so forth, and therefore pretty much everyone agrees it's not part of the Gospel of John. It's not something original to it, right? Similarly, other scholars, they say the same thing. It says, the external manuscript evidence against the originality of this passage is staggering. It first appears in Codex Bezae. In other... it wonders. Metzger rightly calls it an unmistakable insert. So again, another criteria is that, well, scribes are not all going to put the same passage in the same spot. So because it wonders, they call this wondering, right? Where basically some you find this passage sometimes in Luke, sometimes in a different part of John, like in different places in the textual tradition. We know that it was inserted, because if it was original, it wouldn't have this kind of fluidity, right? Okay, so let's go to another example of textual corruption. It's the passage in Mark 13:32 and Matthew 24:36 where Jesus doesn't know the hour, right? What's the passage? The passage says, about that day and hour no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father only. Metzger says, so Metzger's writing, he says, this was unacceptable to scribes who could not reconcile Jesus' ignorance with his divinity, and who saved the situation by simply omitting the phrase nor the Son. So scribes see this passage seems problematic. They believe Jesus is God knows everything, but here it says he doesn't know everything. So what do? Well, what the scribes did was simply omit the phrase, nor the Son. So now you can say that, but about that day and hour, no one knows, neither the angels of heaven, but the Father only. Okay, well, that could also include the Son. It doesn't explicitly negate the Son. You see the point? So that's why they changed it. Let's read here what Athanasius says. He says, many scribes found difficulties with this verse and omitted it for various reasons. In a time where one verse can decide a verdict pertaining to dogmatic views between two populated sects, it seems as if scribes took the vile route and omitted the phrase nor the Son to lend weight to their development and innovative theology. A supporting evidence would be from Athanasius of Alexandria, who tells us of the Arians who used this verse to support their theology. Right, so there are a group of people called the Arians. The Arians believed that Jesus was divine, but not divine in the same sense of the Father. He's not consubstantial with the Father. And as such, they emphasize more of the human aspects of Jesus. So he seems to suffer, he doesn't know everything, etc. Right? So Athanasius tells us about these people, and he says here, these beings, being so, come let us know to examine, but of that day and hour no one knows. He reads the verse, right? For being in great ignorance as regards these words and being superfield about them, they think they have in them an important argument for their heresy. But I, when the heretics allege it and prepare themselves with it, see in them the giants again fighting against God. So he's saying the Arians use this verse as a proof for their theology, and Athanasius is arguing against it, saying this doesn't prove your theology, right? So this is, again, theological disputes going on, right? So this verse is theologically useful, okay? So now we look at the witnesses. Well, we see that the early witnesses, right? So again, because this is a parallel passage, we look at both Matthew and Mark, because it's there in Matthew and Mark. So some witnesses for the Matthean version, they omit the phrase "nor the Son," and it historically became common to read the verse without the phrase in ancient manuscripts that don't contain it, right? So the "nor the Son" variant, which is the Matthean scribes, they omitted it. Why? Because this was theologically problematic. So now most apologists, they'll say, oh, it means declare. Yeah, he doesn't know, it means declare. Like they'll say this cope from other church fathers writing after the 4th century, where they'll say the word know here just means oidin. It doesn't mean actually know, it means to declare. So they'll say it's just Jesus is not, he knows it, but it's just not his place to declare it. But then if that's the case, then why did the scribes change it? If the word clearly meant to declare and it didn't mean cognitive knowledge, why did the scribes of Matthew feel the need to change this verse? Well, obviously because they read it the same way we're reading it, which is that it does mean cognitive knowledge, and therefore it is actually saying that Jesus was ignorant. That's what it means. So this cope is a later kind of, harmonization. It's a later ad hoc apologetical reading, trying to defend it within your belief, right? It's a post hoc rationalization. It's not something that the early Christians believed. The earliest Christians used this verse, and when they read it, they understood what we all mean by it, which is the plain reading, that Jesus is ignorant and he doesn't know the hour. Therefore, he's not God. It's a simple, easy argument. No one can really get around this. But yet, you'll see them doing mental gymnastics with it, right? So now we look at the church fathers. What did they say about this verse? Ambrose, he says this. First of all, the ancient Greek manuscripts do not contain these words, neither the Son. But it is not to be wondered at if they who have corrupted the sacred scriptures have also falsified this passage. The reason for which it seems to have been inserted is perfectly plain, so as it is applied to unfold such blasphemy. Right? So Ambrose here, what does he say? He's saying, if you read this carefully, what he's saying is that he thinks that the corrupted reading is the correct reading. He thinks that the one without nor the Son is the correct reading. In reality, it's the other way around. The original reading is neither the Son nor the Son is the original reading. But he thinks it's the other one. The one that is without it is the original. So he thinks nor the Son was inserted by the Arians. He thinks nor the Son was inserted by the Arians to try and favor their theology. And he calls this a corruption. He says the scriptures have been corrupted and they falsified this passage. So he's admitting that this passage is corrupted and falsified. This is Ambrose, their own church father, right? Jerome, he says the same thing. Jerome apparently agrees with Ambrose, for he says, in some Latin manuscripts is added nor the Son, though in the Greek copies, and especially those of Adamantius, right, of Piraeus, this edition is not found. James Brooks, a commentator of Mark's Gospel, appears to believe that this interpretation is held today, for he says, a scholarly opinion is divided over the authenticity of the words nor the Son. In reality, there isn't much of a scholarly divide. Pretty much Metzger and Ehrman, F.F. Bruce, Daniel Wallace, these kinds of guys, they'll all tell you that, yeah, nor the Son is original, and the scribes omitted it for this particular reason, right? So that's another example. So now we've gone through the woman caught in adultery, we've gone through Mark 13:32. So now what about the ending of Mark? This is what James Tabor says about the ending of Mark. The original ending of Mark was viewed by latter Christians as so deficient. Not only was Mark placed second in order in the New Testament, but various endings were added by editors and copyists in some manuscripts to try and remedy things. So famously, Mark ends with chapter 16 with the woman coming to the tomb, and then they get afraid and then they don't tell anyone. That's verse 8. For the woman fled the tomb and they were afraid and they didn't tell anyone. That's verse 8. And that's how Mark ends. He just ends abruptly there. Scribes were so dissatisfied with this ending. This is the original ending. There's no post-resurrection appearances in Mark. That's only in Matthew and Luke and the other Gospels and Acts and whatever, right? But in Mark, in the earliest Gospel, there is no post-resurrection appearances, okay? And scribes were so uncomfortable with this that they had to invent one. So they added in a whole new ending. And by the way, there isn't just one ending. This is commonly thought that there's only one ending of Mark that was added in. So there's the short version and the long version. There's actually two other endings. So there's a satanic ending of Mark where Satan comes in and he starts doing some weird stuff. And there's another angelic ending of Mark as well. And this is apocryphal endings from the 4th and 5th centuries. Most people don't know about them, but it's for your purposes, there's a long ending and a short ending. The long ending of Mark is the addition. So we'll go through it shortly. He says, even though this ending is patently false, people loved it. And to this day, conservative Christians regularly denounce liberal scholars who point out this forgery, claiming that they're trying to destroy God's word. He's saying that to this day, fundamentalists are arguing with liberals who just say, hey, this is not in the earliest and best manuscripts. Mark didn't actually write it. They say, no, how dare you? It isn't Mark, blah, blah, blah. So it becomes kind of I guess a religious thing. People don't want to admit, or a dogmatic thing. People don't want to admit that it's a later interpolation, right? So Ehrman, he says this. He says that the ending, that this ending found in many English translations and later in Greek manuscripts is not the original. The evidence that these verses were not original to Mark is similar to that similar in kind to that for the passage of the woman taken in adultery. So he says the same kinds of criteria for inauthenticity is there. The verses are absent from our two earliest and best manuscripts of Mark's Gospel, along with other important witnesses. The writing style varies from what we find elsewhere in Mark. The transition between the passages and the one preceding it is hard to understand. For example, Mary Magdalene is introduced in verse 9 as if she hadn't been mentioned yet, even though she has been discussed in the preceding verses. There is another problem with the Greek that makes the transition even more awkward. And there are a large number of words and phrases in this passage that are not found elsewhere in Mark. In short, the evidence is sufficient to convince nearly all textual scholars that these verses are in addition to Mark. So there's basically consensus that this is a fake ending. It's not there. It's a very clear distortion, corruption, interpolation of the text, right? And the reason why, the motivation for why they're doing this is to give an ending that is satisfactory to Christian audiences, because they didn't like the original ending, right? Because it doesn't have any post-resurrection appearances, right? So what are the kind of implications of these kinds of distortions? What's the implication? Well, the evidence is clear, right? The ending is not found in the earliest and best manuscripts of Mark. Metzger writes, he says, Clement of Alexandria and Origen, who are writing in the early 3rd century, show no knowledge of the existing verses. Furthermore, Eusebius and Jerome attest that the passage was absent from almost all Greek copies of Mark known to them. The language and style of the Greek is clearly not Markan, and it's pretty evident that the forger, that basically what the forger did was take sections of the endings of Matthew, Luke, and John and create a proper ending. So in Matthew, Luke, and John, you have these different post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, right? So in Luke, Jesus comes back and he eats fish and honeycomb and he gets them to touch him. In Matthew, they go and they see his ascension, right? Like he stays with them for 40 days and whatever. So there are all these different types of post-resurrection appearance stories, and Mark doesn't have any of them. So what the forger here is doing, he's just taking bits and pieces and putting it together and making his own thing. Right, and also a long ending of Mark, it explicitly says that, or Jesus is explicitly saying that those who believe in him will be able to drink deadly things and it won't harm them. They'll be able to handle snakes and it won't harm them, and they'll be able to speak foreign tongues. Right, so he says that basically, if you believe in Jesus, you're going to be able to do these things, which I mean, no Christian can do. Like, if you just tell a Christian and they believe in this verse, hey, Jesus said, if you're a true believer, you should be able to speak in foreign tongues and play with snakes and drink poison, and it's not going to hurt you. They're going to be like, what the hell? Like, that's obviously not true. So, I mean, even just like logically, this doesn't really seem to make sense, because on their depiction and our depiction, Jesus is a true prophet, and true prophets are not going to lie. You know what I mean? So obviously, this verse is forged. Now, he goes on to say, if we decide to listen to Mark, who is our first witness, what we learn is rather amazing. This is James Tabor speaking. He says, in Mark, on the last night of Jesus' life, he told his intimate followers, following their meal, but after I am raised up, I will go before you in Galilee. What Mark believes is that Jesus had been lifted up or raised to the right hand of God, and that the disciples would see him in Galilee. Mark knows of no accounts of people encountering the received corpse of Jesus, wounds and all, walking around Jerusalem. Now, what does this sound like? What do we believe as Muslims? We believe that Jesus was raised to God, to the first heaven, right? In the good graces of God. This is what we believe. This is what Mark believed. This is the earliest gospel. This is what he believed. He didn't believe in the post-resurrection appearances of the later gospels that were basically made up and exaggerated and became legend or mythologized over time. Like in the Matthean post-resurrection appearances, the ones in Luke, the ones in Acts, these are pretty much no scholars accept these as authentic, right? The earliest ending ends with the empty tomb. And Mark, our earliest witness, he says that Jesus was raised up to the Father, right? His tradition is that the disciples experienced their epiphanies of Jesus once they returned to Galilee right after the 80-day Passover feast and had returned to their fishing in despair. This is precisely what we find in the Gospel of Peter. So it's also corroborated extensively in the Gospel of Peter, which is an apocryphal work, right? We'll go through a few more. So one that you guys should all know is the Johannine comma. The mention of the Trinity is not found in the Greek manuscripts. It appears to have originated as a Latin marginal note that was later taken into the text. So this was added in the 14th century into the Latin Vulgate. Initially was a marginal note, and people added in it as a Trinity. So the verse originally read about the water and the blood and whatever, and people symbolically understood this to be the Trinity. But then, so a person writing this as a tafsir made it part of the text. Eventually it became part of the text, right? So this is the Johannine comma. It's very famous. Pretty much everyone accepts this as a clear case of interpolation. The Bible, like if you read the NIV, it'll literally have it as a footnote, as an interpolation. For most of these, there'll be footnotes saying that, hey, it's not part of the original text, or scholars disputed, or whatever, right? So the same thing is true for the comma. It has all the same signs of corruption. So it's not there in the earliest witnesses. It's not there in Codex Sinaiticus. It has no mention of Father, Word, and Holy Ghost, right? It doesn't show up, right? It doesn't show up until the 14th century in a manuscript called GA 629. That's the earliest manuscript that has it, right? Every other manuscript before that doesn't have it, right? Ehrman cites a consensus on the Johannine comma being an interpolation. He says very clearly, and Metzger says the same thing, that these words are spurious and have no right in the New Testament is certain. The gloss began as a Latin marginal note. So again, another example of a marginal note, an exegesis becoming part of the text when it's not supposed to, right? We'll go through another example. Mark 10:18, right? Now, Mark 10:18 has the story of Jesus speaking to the Jew, right? And the Jew asks him, "Good master, what should I do to gain eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Why do you call me good?" Jesus answered, "None is good except God alone." Here is a pretty much explicit denial of Jesus' divinity. So in the earliest gospel, Mark, Jesus is not divine. He's not consubstantial with the Father, at all, right? He explicitly denies divinity. He says, "Why do you call me good? There's only one good, that's God," right? Now Christians, they try and do acrobatics and say, "Oh, he's speaking figuratively," oh, blah, 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 blah. They're doing these apologetics. But it's very clear that, and even scholars note that this is a very clear denial of divinity, right? Jesus is very clearly denying divinity. And because it's a clear denial of divinity, scribes changed it. In the same way, him saying, "I don't know the hour," is a clear denial of divinity. You can't really reconcile that with divinity. How you divine and you don't know something. In the same way, how you divine and you're not all good. Right, you can't be divine and not all good. So because of that, scribes changed it. Right. So our earliest manuscripts for this passage come in the 4th century, but we have early patristic citations by church fathers who cite it, including the fathers of patristic citations before the 1st century. So we have fathers who before the 4th century cite it, and we have their citations, so we can get a glimpse of what the text looked like in the early tradition in the 2nd, 3rd centuries. Right. And they have it like this. These are the church father citations. So Justin Martyr, writing in 165, he cites it as, "Why do you call me good? One is good, my Father who is in heaven." See the difference. Origen cites it as, "Why do you call me good? None is good, but one, God the Father." Hippolytus cites it as, "Why do you call me good? One is good, my Father which is in the heavens." So they very clearly say that the one who is good is who? The Father. If you go back to the first one, "Why do you call me good? None is good except God alone." This is more unclear. When he says except God alone, it could be the Father, but it also could be Jesus himself. Right? Because for them, they believe in the Trinity. So Jesus and the Father, 3 persons, 1 being, right? So they want to say the reason why they changed it from Father, which was explicitly not Jesus, to God, which could include Jesus, is to try and get around this, right? So what are the implications? Likely there would have been an early variant that was prominently circulating in the first 3 centuries of Christianity. This variant proves to be theologically problematic, as Jesus is evidently expressing an ontological difference between the Father and himself, where the Father has a greater type of goodness that is due to the one true God alone. So again, he's denying being all good. The evidence of this is how Matthew's version changes the question. So look at how Matthew changes the question. Matthew's version says, "Why do you ask me about what is good?" Why do you ask me about what is good? Before it wasn't, "Why do you ask me about what is good?" It is, "Why do you call me good?" You see the difference? Matthew changes it to, "Why do you ask me about what is good?" Right? In Matthew 19:17, instead of Jesus asking, "Why do you call me good?" now he asks, "Why do you ask me about what is good?" This change of the question makes it no longer possible to interpret Jesus' question as denying his own goodness. Secondly, Mark and Luke both confirm each other while Matthew's the outlier here. We know that Matthew used Mark as a source, indicating that scribes felt the need to change it because it undermined Jesus' divinity. So Mark and Luke, you guys are familiar with the synoptic problem, I assume, but in case you're not, pretty much everyone agrees that Matthew used Mark as a source and Luke used Mark as a source, meaning that Matthew and Luke both copied from Mark. Now, it's clear that when Matthew copies, he changed something, and if Luke copied the same thing, but he didn't change it, we know that Matthew's the one who changed it, because then we'd have agreement, like 2-to-1 agreement, right? And this is one of those cases where Matthew is in disagreement with Mark and Luke, which shows that he copied something and changed it. Why did he change it? Because it denied Jesus' divinity, and the scribe wanted to show that Jesus is actually divine. There's another instance of the Matthean scribes changing something about Jesus' divinity to try and prove that he's God, or to get rid of the stuff that shows that he's not God, essentially, right? All right, so we'll go through a few more examples and then we'll end it, inshallah. So we have anti-adoptionist corruptions. And this is why it helps, by the way, to know like what the early different sects of Christianity were, what the early theological disputes were. So adoptionism is pretty much the earliest Christology, according to James Dunn. And adoptionists believe that Jesus was, like the name suggests, adopted as the Son of God, or adopted as God's chosen person at a later point in time during his life. So right now, theology is that, or the Orthodox theology is that Jesus was eternally God, right? He's eternally at the right hand of God. But early Christians, they didn't believe this. They believed that Jesus was adopted at a point in time to be God's son. And the difference was basically, the dispute at the time was, when was Jesus adopted to be his God? Some said he was adopted at the resurrection. Some said he was adopted at his baptism. Some said he was adopted before that, pre-existence. So like John, in the beginning was the Word was with God. John says he was pre-existently adopted as his son, etc., right? So this is the adoptionist school of thought. So they believe Jesus is adopted, and then he's divine in some sense. Still not in the same sense as the Father, but he's divine in some kind of sense, right? So Luke 3:22, it says, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." There's another reading that says, "In you I am well pleased." who can guess which one's the original and which one's not? Obviously, the one that says, today I have begotten you, is an in you I'm well pleased, right? Is an anti-adoptionist corruption. Today I have begotten you. Today I have begotten you is someone adding in that verse, today I have begotten you, to try and prove the point that Jesus was adopted at his baptism. In you I'm well pleased doesn't support that position. So this is an anti-adoptionist corruption, right? Today I have begotten you only happens in Codex Bezae in Greek, but it's echoed by Justin, Irenaeus, and Clement, right? In you I'm well pleased is in these other versions, right? The line supports an adoptionist Christology. Jesus became the Son at the baptism. Pro-Nicene scribes smoothed it to the Markan wording to avoid that implication. So the reason why they changed this verse, or they got rid of this reading, is because it went against what became orthodoxy. It went against Nicene orthodoxy. So Orthodox scribes not infrequently altered texts that might have been taken to suggest that Jesus became the Son of God only at his baptism, right? They also changed passages to highlight their view so that Jesus was already the Son of God before his baptism, so Mark 1, or even before that, coming into the world. And this is what Ehrman says about this. Because the variant occurred already in the 3rd or more likely the 2nd century, the corruption belongs during the period of the adoptionist debates themselves. So during the 2nd and 1st century, when these adoptionist debates were happening, that's when this was likely corrupted, right? So you can trace the lineage of these corruptions, right? We already went through John 1, but there's a bit more to it that I haven't really explained to you. I already told you the difference is the unique God versus the unique Son, right? The unique God versus the unique Son. Ehrman calls this, he says, we are now dealing with not a corruption of the text, but a corruption of a corruption. So there's 2 stages of this corruption. So originally, the first stage is like this. The first stage is that you have the unique Son. So originally, the wording was the unique Son. That got changed to the unique God. Then the unique God became the begotten God. So you end up with the begotten God when it was originally the unique Son. So this is what the textual history suggests, right? We're left with 2 considerations: whether the original text spoke of the unique Son who's in the bosom of the Father, or the unique God who's in the bosom of the Father. The Orthodox proclivities we have already detected name to modify texts that could have been constructed adoptionistically weigh heavily here. It is interesting to observe that the same manuscript evidence corruption also in Hebrews 1:8 also does so in John 1:18 as well. One of these other passages in this instance, however, the change is much better attested, right? So like I told you, so the first one was the unique Son. A scribe changed that to the unique God. Now that's still, by the way, not like co-equal, co-eternal, consubstantial. Then they changed that from unique to begotten. So now it becomes the begotten God. So again, it's getting closer to orthodoxy. Originally, it's farther away from it, right? Then we have anti-docetic interpolation. So I already went through one, which was Luke 22:43, the passage about blood sweating. But then we also have another one in Luke 22, which is Luke 22:19-20, right? So I'm sure you guys, so this is in the scene is the Last Supper, right? And Jesus is giving the speech of the Last Supper, right? And the shorter text reads, "This is my body, but behold, the hand of the one who betrays me is with me on the table." The longer text adds, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in my remembrance. This cup is my new covenant and my blood which is poured for you." So this is very clearly teaching that Jesus is Jesus's body is an atonement for sins. The original reading doesn't teach that, right? Now, how do we know which one's original, which one's not? Well, surprisingly, if you read the Gospel of Luke, you notice that, now Luke is copying from Mark, right? Mark has these passages that scholars call the passion predictions, right? And it's these passages that are found in Mark 8, 9, and 10, where Jesus predicts his own death and resurrection. He says, for the Son of Man came not to serve, but to be served. And he says that the Son of Man is going to be given to the Jews, and on the 3rd day he's going to rise again, etc., right? So he's predicting his death and resurrection. Now, obviously, Jesus never said that. This is a later, most scholars think that Mark actually invented this and put it into Jesus' lips. So the historical Jesus never predicted his own death, and he didn't believe that he was an atonement for sins. This is later Christian back projection onto Jesus by pretty much consensus of scholars like James Tabor, Ummah, Metzger. They all agree, right? What's interesting is that Luke is copying from Mark. So Mark, the author of Mark, he thinks that Jesus is an atonement for sins because he's influenced by Paul. Luke copies Mark, but he doesn't believe the same thing. He doesn't believe that Jesus is an atonement for sins. So he takes out those verses. So whenever you have Luke is copying from Mark, whenever Mark starts talking about Jesus is going to die for the sins of the world, Mark 8, whatever, Luke explicitly takes it out. So then it's surprising that a scribe realizes this. He realizes that Luke doesn't have the atonement. He doesn't have this kind of teaching that Jesus is going to die for the sins of the world. So he adds it back in here. He adds it back in here that Jesus is going to be, his body's the bread and this wine is my blood and whatever. This kind of language, right? This is not original. So what do scholars say? It is difficult, if not impossible, to imagine an Orthodox scribe deleting words that so clearly affirm the salvific significance of Jesus' death. The shorter text must therefore be original. So what he's doing here is employing the criterion of this similarity. What's more likely? Is a scribe more likely to add in, this is my blood and this is my covenant for you? Is he more likely to do that? Or is he more likely to take that away? What's more likely? Obviously, he's more likely to add it in to support his beliefs than to take it away and go against his beliefs, right? Whether or not the variant antedates its first extant occurrence in the 12th century is immaterial to my overall point. Orthodox Christians, beginning at least with the docetic controversies of the 2nd century, began focusing on salvific importance of the real blood of Jesus Christ to such an extent that they naturally read such things into and onto the text that had originally not said a word about them. So originally it didn't say anything about Jesus dying for the sins of the world, that his bread is a covenant and his blood is poured out for you and whatever. This is all added in later by later Christians. It's back projected on Jesus's lips, right? It's also worth noting, right, that with all these kinds of interpolations, scribes will try to harmonize them. I spoke about this briefly, but it's worth giving some examples as well, right? Scribes would try and harmonize these different readings of the text that conflicted with them, right? So, for example, many early manuscripts, including our earliest Bibles, so we said the earliest manuscripts were Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, have Matthew agree with John that Jesus was struck by a soldier's spear and blood came out of him. So in John, if you look at the crucifixion scene, John is the only one that has Jesus struck by a spear and blood comes out of him. Right? Blood comes out of it. In the other in the synoptics, right, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this isn't the case. Some manuscripts said, well, that's a contradiction. Why would Matthew and Luke and Mark not mention it? So a scribe of Matthew added this in some of our manuscripts. This is a harmonization. Someone's trying to harmonize between John and Matthew, right? And we see these kinds of harmonizations everywhere. We have manuscripts showing that this is an insertion. But how many such edits were made behind the curtain? The reason why there's a curtain here is because we have no idea what's going on here. We only know here, from 200 to 300, we know where these we can reconstruct and kind of sift through and see what are the variants and corruptions that were happening here. Before 200, there's a curtain here. We don't know what the variants are that are here. We don't know what the corruptions that were happening here are. So it's very likely we could be reading a verse, we all think it's original, but in reality it's an interpolation for a reason that we have no idea why. So what I'm saying is that these harmonizations, this is one that we're lucky enough to realize that it's a harmonization, right? Because we have the manuscript evidence. But there are others that we don't have manuscript evidences for that are probably harmonizations, and we don't even know that they exist because we don't have the manuscript attestation. Like I said, for the first 3 centuries, we don't have any full manuscripts. It's only in the 4th century we start getting full manuscripts. In the 1st century, we have nothing. In the 2nd century, we get scraps. In the 3rd century, we get slightly bigger chunks. And in the 4th century, you finally get the complete manuscripts, right? So we can identify at least 100 of such harmonizations in the first 500 years for which we have manuscripts. It follows that any time you argue from the fact that 2 gospels agree, you can't know if that's real agreement or like it's fabricated later, right? So how do we know, for example, let's say something simple like the feeding of the 500, right? How do we know that Jesus actually did the feeding of the 5,000 or the feeding of the 4,000 in Mark and Matthew? We can't know. Well, someone will say look, Mark has it, Matthew has it, Luke has it, right? It's multiply attested. Well, first of all, they all copied from each other. And second of all, even if it wasn't, how do you know that someone didn't just harmonize it? Like a scribe, how do you know Matthew didn't have it originally and someone added it in later? You have no idea. That could plausibly be the case, and you have no way of disproving that. So these kinds of harmonizations really kind of put a dent in the reliability of the New Testament because you don't know what is actually harmonized and what is not. We're lucky that we have cases where we know, but in most of the cases, we're not going to know. That's the reality of the situation. So in conclusion, what I've shown is that there are numerous cases of interpolation, corruption, and fabrication in the text of the New Testament. We also presented theologically motivated alterations. We've shown why scribes were motivated to do these kinds of corruptions. And most Christians are completely ignorant about this. They have no idea about any of this. They have no idea about the consensus of scholarship about these different interpolations. And they think the Bible is just eyewitness testimony. Honest people recorded it. Honest people transmitted it. And they're completely ignorant of this whole debate and discussion. Therefore, it's our responsibility to educate them about the history of the scripture. And in doing so, we bring them a step closer to Islam. All right. Barakallah fikum. Wa akhiru da'wa walhamdulillah.